If you want to join our growing community, please head on over to freshedpodcast.com/support. You can save FreshEd by becoming a member today. This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brim. Today, Fazal Rizvi joins me to talk about his forthcoming book entitled Globalization and Educational Futures. Fazal revisits the rise of the popular discourses of globalization, examines many of its discontents, and suggests nonetheless that it is too hasty to imagine its total demise. Fazal Rizvi is an Emeritus Professor of Global Studies in Education at the University of Melbourne. Fazal Rizvi, welcome to FreshEd.
Thank you very much.
Fazal, you have been writing about globalization and education. That's kind of what you're known for, and you've been writing about it for more than 3 decades. I mean, that is a long time. A lot has changed over that time. And I want to sort of focus today on how we might think about globalization and education in today's world. But maybe to start, it would be really good to just sort of understand how you even got interested in this topic 30 years ago.
Well, in 1989, there were major changes taking place in the world. Not only the fall of Berlin Wall, but lots of other things, including commercialization of the internet. Okay, so if you look at the list of things that happened in '89, it was really quite significant. So I was already thinking about those changes that were taking place and trying to make sense of them. During that year, towards the end of the year, I attended a lecture by Anthony Giddens, the sociologist from Cambridge, who presented a paper in which he did not mention the idea of globalization, but did talk about time-space compression and the conditions of modernity, which later became a book of his in 1991. And that's actually where my interest can be traced back to. You know, I became really interested. But then I started viewing my own personal journey from India to Australia and my diasporic connections through the prism of globalization. So globalization became not only a theoretical interest, but also a personal interest.
1989 seems so long ago, and things have radically changed since then. And we are talking in the aftermath of a second Trump presidency. In a couple months, he will become the president of the United States once again. And he's already been talking about things like tariffs and stopping immigration and, really sort of putting this sort of ethno-nationalist sort of America first priority. And, as I was preparing for this interview, I actually listened back to a keynote address that you gave in 2016. And in that keynote, you basically focused on Trump when he first was elected, because it was just in the aftermath, and also Brexit, which was recently passed but not yet sort of adopted. It took a couple years. And you argued at the time that Trump and the Brexiteers sort of embraced this leftist critique of globalization, while sort of bolting on, and you use this word, bolting on, ethno-nationalism. So I guess 8 years later, with Trump's second victory, how would you assess this current situation, given how you were thinking about it from 2016?
I think going back to 2016, it was really quite interesting because there was a critique of globalization inherent in his language. Ethno-nationalism was really forefront of his. The tariff agenda was also there, and indeed, as was the agenda of not being involved, and critiques of multilateralism and multinational institutions were also there. Remember, one of his first acts was to withdraw from the Paris Accord, and that was really quite interesting and disturbed a lot of people who are committed to environmental sustainability. But as I started looking at his language, it had all these ethno-nationalist elements, but at the same time, the elements of global capitalist economy were left untouched. Okay, the structure remained the same. So in other words, he was still about trade, although with tariffs. He was still about immigration, although with restrictions. So in other words, neoliberalism did not die with him. Okay, a neoliberal version of globalization didn't die with him. And one of the things that I've always been interested in is how the right has used the language of the left and re-articulated it. The word re-articulation comes from my reading of Raymond Williams, okay, and Stuart Hall. Basically, it's using the same word but making it mean something substantially different, quite often the opposite. So, for example, Raymond Williams was committed to community. Raymond Williams was committed to devolution. He was committed to democracy. He was committed to a whole range of ideas that the right captured it, but actually translated it in the language of the markets. You see what I mean? Right. So in other words, the words were the same. And I've thought a great deal about that. Why is it that they do not actually come up with their own vocabulary, but use the vocabulary of the left?
Why not? How do you explain that?
I actually think that there is a reason for that, and this is simply this, that the terms that are already known in the professions, in the civil society, and people are committed to those, they want to not abandon those terms as seeming to be radically different, but continuous with the kind of values that teachers, for example. So the idea of devolution was already there in the 1980s and even before that, 70s. But in the 1990s, neoliberal discourses of globalization absolutely turned it upon its head, and it became decentralization. It became, rather than thinking about it in democratic language, it became, if you like, public management language. Right. So the term was kept, but with very different meaning. Yeah. And I think that is essential in order to make sure that people are brought into that discourse, or discursive community, without actually feeling that they're being radically re-altered in terms of their values and commitments.
And this notion of devolution turning into decentralization, also turning into sort of like deregulation, creating the unfettered market to operate as it pleases outside of the state control.
But the public management, new public management in particular, was informed by many of the precepts of neoliberalism and market logic. So as a result, they were together. And what happened was deregulation suddenly became an obvious answer to the attempts to provide devolution, decentralization, etc., etc. Right. So I'm really interested in the ways in which the words are used in relation to each other and made into mean something radically different.
Yeah. What terms do you see that are potentially being re-articulated, being co-opted from the left and being re-articulated for sort of a more conservative agenda?
Well, localization is one of those terms. Basically, one of the things that Trump is very keen on is abandon the Department of Education. He's not going to do it by saying that education is not important. He's going to say education best belongs to local communities and parents. Okay, and this is the kind of thing that number of governors in the United States have done, including Virginia and Florida and various other places, which basically have highlighted the power of the parent and power of the communities to do their own thing. So my own view is what he's likely to do if he does abolish the Department of he will do it in the language of federalism, American federalism, and in the language of efficiency. Yeah. Okay, efficiency will become the meta value against which he'll redefine various other words, and that's why I think Ramaswamy and Musk agenda is really very. They have deliberately chosen the term Department of Government Efficiency. Okay, so in other words, they have actually brought the term efficiency to the center of public and policy discourse in order to re-articulate the meanings of lots of terms in terms of market efficiency.
You can also see something similar with abortion rights.
Absolutely.
And this notion of Trump saying, I'm not against abortion rights, I'm against the federal government having a law of abortion, and we want to put it back to the states. We're a federal, society, and we'll let the states decide what to do.
In many ways, many of the Trumpian theorists, if you like, are members of the Federalist Society. And they interpret federalism slightly differently to federalism, meaning of federalism in Australia or in Germany or in other places. They really believe in decentralization of a certain kind in which individuals have, they come very close to libertarianism, and as a result, their notion of federalism is, how can we actually look at the sensibilities of libertarianism and translate those into the language of federalism.
So in 2022, you put out a book where it was an edited volume, and it was entitled Reimagining Globalization and Education. And I guess the question is, why did globalization and education need to be reimagined at that time?
Well, it was very interesting. We had written, Bob Lingard and I had written a book called Globalizing Educational Policy in 2010. And in 2020, it occurred to both of us that many of the arguments in that book may have actually become exhausted, may have run out their use-by date, So as a result, we felt that a new edition was needed. At the same time, very happily, and gratefully, the book was very well received around the place and has been translated in 3 or 4 languages, and we kept on getting pressure from the publisher to do another version. And we sort of said, no, we can't do that, we just don't have time. And we had both just retired, and so the idea was to actually get something like 10 to 12 of our very close friends to comment on the relevance of the arguments from the 2010 book in 2020. Okay, so as a result, we invited people against our own understanding of what had changed. So what had changed? Well, to start off with, rise of ethno-nationalism and populism, around the world, not only in the United States. Okay, the deep awareness of environmental issues and environmental crisis, that had become an issue. Okay, deep concerns about the fall of belief in institutional, in multinational institutions generally, but multinational in particular. Deeper awareness that economy was changing from the kind of manufacturing economy to the service economy at a much more rapid rate than we had even realized. And that is likely to change even more with the gig economy and the various other iterations of it. So there was another. We had believed that the idea of meritocracy had become deeply problematic. We had decided that organization of higher education had become somewhat problematic in the new age. So basically, we'd identified all these topics that we felt represented the changes that had taken place over the decade from 2010 to 2020. Right. And then we identified our friends who could write on those topics. Okay, so that was the way in which we structured the book. Unfortunately, I don't think it worked out as well as we had hoped.
Why not?
Well, the reason why it didn't work out is something to do with the nature of academic work. When people are asked to write an article, they don't always take seriously the narrative that you provide them. And they write whatever it is that they'd been working on. Right. And because we had given them the license, sort of saying, we want you to think about our arguments in relation to your area of expertise now. Okay, so they wrote about their expertise, but did not engage with the arguments of the 2010 book to the same extent that we had hoped.
Right. I guess, yeah, coherence can be hard when you have large groups of people working on something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of the people that we chose are very, very busy people, you know. And as a result, it became really very difficult to actually push them to revise and revise and revise their chapters, you know. I mean, one revision was as much as we could have hoped for. So as a result, I mean, our noble aspirations were not realized. Although it turned out to be quite a good book.
I have looked through it, and I must say some of the articles are really good. They stand up on their own, but I can understand the larger critique you're making of how they all fit together into this larger critique of your earlier work, and it didn't necessarily hit. So what would you have liked them to articulate? Like what critiques can you make about your own work?
For example, we would have liked to sort of say changing nature of work and labor relations and employment. We wanted that to be highlighted, to sort of say that the ways in which we interpret the global economy had to be rethought and reimagined, you know. So in other words, we said nothing about environmental crisis in 2010. And we said it just needed to be said, you know. We said nothing about youth cultures. We assumed that needed to be changed quite dramatically as well. We said nothing about the rise of Asia, okay, especially China, and the difficult relationship between China and the West. So we actually asked Michael Peters to write an article because he was working at Beijing Normal University at that time, and we thought that he would write about it in a very thoughtful, and he did actually, except you know, not in relation to the arguments of our book, but in relation to whatever it is that he wanted to say at that time.
So what
I'm not being critical.
No,
I'm saying it's a function of the nature of academic work.
That's right. And again, each of the chapters stand up on their own. That's right. And that's, you know, and they are good pieces. I guess all of those sort of silences that you have articulated, when you think of them collectively today, what do they tell us about globalization and education? Well,
let me go back to how I have always thought about globalization. I don't like the abstraction globalization. I have two ways of interpreting globalization, empirically or normatively. Okay, empirically, it is basically conditions that we can refer to as the facts of global interconnectivity and interdependence. Okay, normatively, we can say that it is a way of thinking about possibilities of globalization in relation to that interconnectivity and interdependence. Can you see the relationship between? That's how I've thought about it. My own view is that globalism as a neoliberal articulation has now become exhausted, okay, and now become exhausted. So as a result, the ways in which people interpreted globalization in 1990s within the framework of neoliberalism, or what I call neoliberal imaginary, okay, has become incredibly difficult. What has not disappeared are the facts of interconnectivity.
Right.
Okay, and indeed facts of interdependence. And I think that's where populism will run into problems. Okay, because as much nationalism and ethno-nationalism as you push, you know, interconnectivity is here to stay.
Yeah, and I mean, on that populism and interconnectivity, you know, it is fascinating to see someone like Steve Bannon make these connections across the globe and sort of connecting right-wing populist movements across the globe together as a form of globalization.
And that conservative forum that is held every year, you know, that is becoming globalized. So as a result, you know, connectivity across. The other aspect of connectivity is technology. You know, technology is not going to go away. It's going to make it easier for us to talk to each other and make friends and make links and all those sort of things. Especially with the rising number of diasporic populations in a country like United States. I mean, in the United States, we've got something of the order of 1.5 million people of Indian background, you know, and they are quite highly placed. And they are absolutely committed to making sure that their diasporic links are as productive for them personally and for the two nations that they belong to. That's not going to disappear. Yeah. So as a result, I'm sort of saying that that abstraction, insofar as is linked to global interconnectivity of globalization, shouldn't be abandoned. Okay, so globalization is here to stay, but in another form.
Right, and you're also not saying that because this neoliberal imaginary might be shifting or coming to an end or whatever it is, globalization definitely staying there, but you're also not saying that capitalism is going anywhere. It's sort of, capitalism itself might be shifting as well, but it's sort of interconnected with this notion of globalization.
Radically. I mean, you have a look at somebody like Elon Musk. You know, he's promoting an ethno-nationalist language, but his behavior and his actions are completely global. You know, in relation to the ways in which he organizes his business, in relation to he thinks about Bitcoin now, in relation to the ways in which he thinks about links, and his own preparedness to interfere in other countries' local politics. You know, so as a result, he's an incredibly global citizen. But at the same time, you know, he is also encouraging a form of what Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism. You know, and I think globalization is being attempted to be remade by techno bros.
Yeah, and that bringing up you know, Yanis's book on techno-feudalism, because that he sort of is arguing that we're entering this period that is not capitalism as we know it. That's right. And so we sort of are living in this moment of there is still capitalism, but there's also these sort of cloud capital, as he calls it, where we as consumers are, or digital serfs, as he says, enter these platforms, these digital platforms, and we give over our data. We might pay money to be there, and we get sort of trapped in these digital platforms. And the value extraction is not from surplus labor like it is in capitalism, but rather from the digital trails that we make on these platforms that can then be monetized and control our sort of need, wants, and desires.
Well, and also it actually relates to the nature of employment, you know, and what kind of jobs we are going to have. And that relates to education, of course, you know, because there are going to be very, very few people who are going to be the owners of cloud capitalism, if you like. The rest of the people are either going to be serfs, okay, service sector, okay, or in between, you know, basically small business people, you know, with very precarious lives, as the guy standing points out, you know. So as a result, we are going to have three layers of, there's the capital ownership class, there are the serfs, you know, basically in the service sector. And then there are people who are trying to lead very precarious life and have huge aspirations, but very little possibility of getting into the capital owning class.
So are these some of the topics that you are working through in this new book that you're currently writing, called, you're currently calling it Globalization and Education Futures?
This is a book that is part of a series that Bob and I edit, called Ideas in Education, or Key Ideas in Education. And the construction of the book is very interesting. Basically what we invite for this series is very, very mature age senior scholars, you know, who are approaching their retirement or have gone past their retirement. And the idea of the book series is to get them to say something about how they became interested in a theorist or in an idea, how has their thinking changed over the, and what is likely to be the future. Okay, so as a result, it is a book that introduces the theorist as well as the theorizer. Okay, talking about how their ideas are connected. So, for example, we have a book by Leonardo Zeus Leonardo, okay, on Edward Said and education. And the book is simply about how he became interested in it, how his reading of Edward Said has changed, and how it is relevant going future. Okay.
Interesting.
There are other books by Deborah Spitzman on Freud and education. There is another book by Carl Grant on Du Bois and education, Antonia Dada on Freire and education, and so on and so on. But all of them, and there are new books coming out, one on Rabindranath Tagore and education by Ratna Ghosh from McGill. So that's the general idea of the book. But there are also concepts that we're looking at. So James G. did a book on literacy and education and how he became interested in literacy education issue. And then how his thinking has changed with the emergence of technology and all those sort of things. So I am writing that book in the same tradition, for the same series, looking at how my thinking about globalization, originated and has changed, and what it is, I think, the educational futures are likely to look like.
How would you begin to really help us understand globalization and education and its futures? Because it's a plural, right? It's multiple futures. How are you seeing it currently?
Well, to begin with, I think there's going to be a major, tense debate, conflict even, over future. Already we are seeing that future is being interpreted and being organized and being steered in different ways. So there is the right-wing future of this nirvana that they are promising, which is unlikely to be realized because of the conditions of global interconnectivity. That kind of globalization is being proposed, but is not likely to be realized. There's the technocratic globalization that countries in Bangalore and Singapore and Beijing and Shanghai are promoting, anticipatory governance and things like this. There's also the conception of democratic governance that is also floating around the place. And then, of course, there is the idea of techno-governance, which is linked to all of those three, but in different ways. So what I'm trying to do in the final chapter in this particular book is trying to sort of say how these competing ideas of future are based on differing assumptions, differing ideas, but they're also interacting with each other in a whole range of complicated ways.
How then does education fit into this sort of multifaceted landscape that you're painting?
Educational institutions around the place have become, a term that I've used a number of times now, exhausted. Okay, and I use that term quite deliberately, because it's not that we don't think education is important, but I think the modalities of educational governance and educational thinking, they are becoming exhausted from the past. And institutions are becoming exhausted too. I mean, you look at University of Melbourne, University of Canberra, University of Illinois, they all appear exhausted institutions. And as a result, they're trying to figure out what it is that's going to be the future. And my own view is that the future is going to lead to a diversity of types of education. Yeah. But how that state is going to manage those alternatives is totally unclear. And exactly what the state would want to do is also unclear, because already we are seeing indications that the state doesn't want to get involved in education to any great extent. But the market can't do it either.
No, and it raises a fascinating question of what does the public mean in this sense?
That's right, exactly.
When there's all these different alternatives that you can potentially choose to go to.
Well, and that's where the localization agenda becomes really complicated. Localization agenda could become so inbred and so exclusive of each other that a coherent public space is almost impossible to realize, So, I mean, I don't know whether you know the work of Michael Sandel. He has been talking about this quite a bit, And basically, I mean, I have to say that in many ways, he believes that some form of Jewish pragmatism is what is required. And I've been thinking about that. And I'm sure there are a lot of philosophers in education in United States in particular would say it's about bloody time. You know what I mean? But I'm not at all clear how that kind of pragmatism that he's presenting, which he's linking to a democratic theory, might emerge. In other words, he's thinking about creation of a public space. But if you're going to have diversification and localization and a form of libertarianism, then how do you bring all those diverse elements together? And who does it?
That's right. I think what the public means, sort of, it has to be rearticulated.
Well, I think so, but it's very difficult to articulate because, my own view is that requires some mode of diasporic and ethical thinking, thinking how scattered people can nevertheless get together, okay? Scattered, not only geographically scattered, but also politically scattered people, How do they come together, and develop some common good, and that's very, very difficult to even imagine at this stage, given that we are going through a stage where problems are becoming more and more evident, but solutions are becoming very elusive.
Well, Fazal Rizvi, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Really a pleasure to talk, and really nice to do this in person.
Okay, thank you very much.
Fazal Rizvi is an Emeritus Professor of Global Studies in Education at the University of Melbourne. His forthcoming book will be entitled Globalization and Educational Futures. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ngunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements, and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.